Welcome back, guys. We're discussing the Roaring 20s today, and this is the first decade you start to see a lot of modernization, a lot of modern kind of fads and things come into being. If you look at the pictures here, there's the modern day swimsuit in the 1920s, both male and female. Check that out. There's Ernest Hemingway, famous author, and there's actress Joan Crawford. She is one of the ones who helped invent the Charleston. She is the same Joan Crawford the movie Mommy Dearest was about. So, the lives of people. They were once isolated in rural communities, tightly controlled values, high standards of religious morality. Now we have the migration of people into more urban areas, changes the moral values, and there's less control over a whole community. Very fast-paced city life often intimidated people and changed people. So the new morality, as you see here, loving family, personal satisfaction, women in the workforce, cars providing independence and privacy. All these things, with traditional families, except for the loving family, would be frowned upon. We also have this new science come up. Really, it's not new. It's been around, but it rears its ugly head in the 1920s as well. And this is eugenics, scientific research that deals with improving heredity traits. Basically says human inequalities were inherited and warned against breeding with the unfit. This fuels the nativist movement of the early 20s. This also fuels a lot of discriminatory practices, racism, and discrimination. Basically, it's the science of why we're different, but we know genetically we're all the same. So this young lady, Margaret Sanger, she was an American birth control activist. She opened the first birth control clinic in the U.S. in 1916. In 1916 and 1921, Sanger founded the American Birth Control League. In New York City, she organized the first birth control clinic staffed by all female doctors. And as far as the magic pill is concerned, she set on a mission. She wanted a pill that would provide women a cheap, safe, effective female control and contraception. The first oral contraception was made available in 1960 with the advent of the pill. So she got to see her lifelong goal being brought to the masses. So the standard of living, the business of America, as Calvin Coolidge put it, was business. So he's the one that coins that phrase, the business of America is business. The effects of the automobile, you get freedom to travel, but it also opens up a lot of areas around cities, so you get this thing called urban sprawl and what we call today suburbs. Airline industries develop a safe and faster way to travel. Electrical lights, electricity lights the whole nation. It's starting to light up. There's still a lot of areas not lit up yet. And in the 1920s, the medium of communication would be the radio. So here's some more pictures. There's a Westinghouse heat lamp. So with prosperity, the growth of the advertising industry happens in the 1920s. Advertisements sold things that people didn't really know they needed until they heard the ad. Preys on fears. It's very modern. As you see, the psychology of advertising, businesses wanted to know how to get the consumer to buy their product. What they found was bright colors worked really well, especially red. Got people's attentions. Also, slogans worked well. They got people's attention as well. Reach for a Lucky Strike instead of candy sold millions of cigarettes in the early 20s and 30s. So if you want to know why all these modern day companies use red, use blue, yellow, this stuff has already been figured out, and it started in the 1920s as to how to get you to buy something. So as you see, productivity increases. Buying on installment plans become a thing in the 1920s, where you can pay it off. Going into debt used to be shameful. You used to be put in prison for going into debt. Now it seems acceptable. In the 1920s, it seemed like everybody's living in debt and on credit. So here's what an assembly line at Ford looked like, just to cut through. Just some ideas of the Model T here. You look, you don't have to write this down at all, but 1908 is $850. Look at 1924, $295. All right, lower production cost, increased volume of sales. In the 1920s, Henry Ford could not find people to make the Model T. He would train them. It took him about 6 weeks to train somebody how to work on the assembly line, and they usually worked there a day or 1 week. And that was because the job was so boring, it was so monotonous. So what does he do? He increases the pay to $5 a day, which is the highest pay in the country at that time in Detroit. You went to Detroit if you wanted to get $5 a day because that's who was paying it. He did this to keep the employees, and he didn't have to continually train them. He also gave them an 8-hour workday, and he worked to undermine union loyalty any way he could. He hired managers. He kept open shops. So the new role of women flappers, these were young women of modern times, as you see in the picture to the left. The hairstyles, the dress, the attitudes, behavior. There's sort of a double standard. Men had one standard, women had another. Flappers had one standard, conservatives had another. So you had the clash of conservative values and modernistic values in this time. Opportunities for women increase, and the families will change. New dances here: the foxtrot, camel walk, tango, hip hop, and the shimmy. And of course, the big one of the 1920s would be the Charleston. Mass media comes into existence. Really, it had been around, but in the 1920s, with new technologies, more people were reading papers and listening to radio and catching athletic events and entertainment than ever before. So as you see, schooling is expanded. They want to educate the masses, so schools are going to expand. New coverage of events began. The invention of the radio. So literature of the 1920s, many writers felt alienated. Sinclair Lewis, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he writes The Great Gatsby. Gertrude Stein, she writes The Lost Generation. Ernest Hemingway, Farewell to Arms. T.S. Eliot, Wasteland. Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. Art and literature, as you see, expression of the individual, bold and colorful. Realism, basically showing a disenfranchisement with society, and of course bohemian art becomes big in the 20s. If I can find the button here. So some sports heroes here. Increased leisure time allows people to pursue pastimes, and one of them would be, of course, baseball. And the first big dynamo of the 1920s would be Babe Ruth. Jack Dempsey, Gene Tooney, some famous boxers, Red Grange, football player. Notre Dame establishes the first college football dynasty. Golfer Bobby Jones there. Lucky Lindy, the transatlantic flight happens in 1927. Charles Lindbergh, he crosses the Atlantic Ocean, and that plane there, the Spirit of St. Louis, it's in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. If you're interested in going to see it, you can. Amelia Earhart, she is the first famous female pilot we have. There are others out there, but she's the first celebrity pilot we have. Motion pictures, Hollywood emerges in the 1920s. They start making these motion pictures, in 1915 the first one comes out, but Charlie Chapman here, he's the one in the center in the black suit, Little Tramp, he's a famous comedian. Clara Bow, she is the it girl of the 1920s. Rudolph Valentino in the top right hand corner. And when films start, adding sound to them. You get talking films in 1927. The first one is The Jazz Singer, Al Jolson. Mickey Mouse comes along in 1930 and establishes Walt Disney. The Harlem Renaissance. Causes of the Harlem Renaissance would be the Great Migration, discrimination, Black is Beautiful campaign, pride in African American culture, well-educated middle class. Areas affected by African American Renaissance would be northern cities, Harlem being the largest, and it celebrates African American culture. What is the Harlem Renaissance? It is a literary and artistic movement. Some important writers would be Langston Hughes in the top, Zora Neale Hurston down at the bottom right-hand corner, and her famous book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Claude McKay, he's a poet. Alan Locke, he wrote The New Negro. Jean Toomer, she wrote Cain, and some famous performers, Florence Mills in the Broadway play Shuffle Along, Josephine Baker, who is a dancer as well, and Mabel Mercer. Some jazz musicians, Paul Robeson, Louis Armstrong at the top right, or top left-hand corner, Cab Calloway, right below Louis Armstrong. They both pioneered this thing called scat, where you make noises instead of pronouncing lyrics. Duke Ellington playing the piano, and he worked at the Cotton Club for many years. Bessie Smith, and at one time in 1927, she was the highest paid entertainer in the world. First, politics. Oscar de Priest, he wanted fines and imprisonments for lynchings. He wanted to make Lincoln's birthday a national holiday. The NAACP, they wanted anti-lynching legislation as well, and they wanted to keep racists out of office. African American goals here, as you see, they celebrated African American culture. That would be Marcus Garvey to the left in the picture. He wanted Negro nationalism, glorify black culture and unity. He wanted separation from whites. He proposed going back to Africa. He even opened the Black Star Cruise Line, bought a cruise ship, and actually had, I think, one ship over there, sent one ship over. It's not very successful, but it did give African Americans a sense of pride. Marcus Garvey's convicted of mail fraud and jailed, and when he's released, he's deported back to Jamaica. We are finished.